Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Montgomery Parks Speaker Series. I'm Mike Riley, Director of Parks, and I'm so glad you could join us today. Before we get started with an excellent program, I have a few housekeeping notes I just want to go over. First, we're recording this presentation, and we'll be providing a link following the presentation so you can refer back to any information that is presented today. Second, I want to direct your attention to the upper right of your screen where you see a question mark. This is the Q&A box. This is where you can submit your questions or comments at any time throughout the presentation. We'll set aside time at the end of today's session to address the questions. Next, for those of you who are pursuing continuing education credits through the American Planning Association's Professional Institute or the Landscape Architecture Continuing Education System, please click on the sign-in link in the Q&A box so we have a record of your attendance today. Also, just a very quick introduction to our agency for those of you who may not be familiar with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. We're located in Montgomery County, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. We're a bi-county agency that also includes our neighbor, Prince George's County. We're the proud recipients of 6 national gold medals for Parks and Recreation Management as the best park system in the country. And our park system in Montgomery County comprises 424 parks, over 37,000 acres of land, which is about 10% of the land mass of Montgomery County. Between Montgomery and Prince George's, we serve over $2 million residents of the DC metro area. Now let's get into today's great topic. This year, we have seen a movement across the country to confront public symbols such as monuments and public art that carry legacies of racism and oppression. How do we go about re-examining historic monuments? And how do we move forward to ensure our public spaces are welcoming and inclusive for everyone? Joining us today to provide some insight into this topic is Paul Farber. Paul is the director of Monument Lab that cultivates and facilitates critical conversations around the past, present, and future of monuments. Monument Lab collaborates with students, educators, activists, and agencies to make a generational change in the ways art and history live in public spaces. Paul is also an author and curator and earned his PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan. Before I turn it over, with that introduction, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you everyone for being here, and especially much gratitude to the team at Montgomery Parks for all their preparation to get ready for today, and all of you. I'm Paul Farber. I'm the director of Monument Lab. We're a public art and history studio. I represent a team of people today, and I'm really thrilled to be here virtually with you. Our work is rooted in the idea that monuments are places to connect, to meet challenges of our society, and to work toward transforming our visions and our perspectives. And as you'll hear in my presentation, when we say monument, we are thinking about an expansive field of commemorative sites, of landscapes, of different approaches to the ways that art and history will live in public. And what I hope to do today is give a little bit of context, a little bit of a window into this moment that we're in around reckoning and reimagining our monument landscape. And then to kind of walk you through the Monument Lab process, some of the work that we've done in building prototype monuments and doing participatory research, with my hope that it might connect with some of the places and projects and maybe even questions that some of you have. And so as we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm reaching you from Philadelphia, which is the ancestral homelands of the Lenni Lenape people. And in Philadelphia, there's a great kind of civic pride on one hand about the roots of the landscape, especially the Great Treaty of Friendship that William Penn agreed to with the Lenni Lenape tribe. But we're also a place where that very Treaty of Friendship was unraveled by William Penn's sons and associates in what is known to history as the Walking Purchase Path, a massive dispossession and land theft of Lenni Lenape land. Philadelphia is also the home of Independence Hall, of the Declaration of Independence, and also is a place where enslavement was braided together with these stories of foundational freedom. And in fact, if you go to Independence Mall in Philadelphia and you're waiting in line to enter the pavilion for the Liberty Bell, you will kind of make your way through or right around the President's House, which was excavated in the last 10 years as a archaeological site and reinterpreted as the first presidential residence, and also as the first presidential slave quarters, because George and Martha Washington rotated enslaved African Americans in and out of Philadelphia and back to Mount Vernon. And because there was a law on the books in Philadelphia that if an enslaved African American was in the city for more than 6 months, they would gain freedom. You can read more about this in works like Never Caught by the historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar, about the story of Ona Judge, an enslaved woman who escaped in Philadelphia. I bring these up as one hand to acknowledge our complicated, complex history, but also just to remind us about the kind of legacies that we deal with when we're talking about public art, public history, public commemoration. We have a history that is worth unpacking, filling out, understanding the complexities. We're not looking to, nor do we have the luxury of having simply good or bad history. We have to do the work to think about how these legacies live into the present. And so it's with that spirit, I talk about kind of where we are with Monument Lab. I mean, we started as a classroom project in 2012, asking questions with our students about who gets represented in public space, who does the representing, and what are the connections between our symbols and our systems of democracy. Over the years, we have grown with a small but mighty team, with groups of artists and fellows and people that we work with in municipal government. We are really thrilled and grateful to be the inaugural recipients of a grant from the Mellon Foundation from their brand new Monuments Project, a 5-year, $250 million investment in telling a fuller history of our country in our commemorative landscape. The first thing that we are doing, and we're right in the middle of, is a national monument audit. We are gathering together every data set that exists on a federal, state, local level to really get a sense of how we track our monuments. What are the stories and the systems that we have? What are the gaps? What's missing? And all of this will be released in the spring of 2021 and be a part of a national campaign to open field offices, Monument Lab sites where we invest in coalitions of local artists and educators and organizers. And so that's a place where we find ourselves now in our work. Of course, while we've been working for the better part of a decade, what we have done is grown alongside and in a symbiotic connection with a growing movement of memory justice workers, artists, organizers, educators, students, municipal art agencies in all kinds of ways. And you know, thinking about how to typify that, there is not a slideshow that's long enough to show you how extensive this movement is. But I wanted to bring up this two-part image. And this is, of course, for those who recognize, the site on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, where a Robert E. Lee statue has been the kind of signpost of Monument Avenue since 1890. Richmond, as the former capital of the Confederacy, generations afterward, in 1890, Monument Avenue was founded as a whites-only segregated real estate development, and monuments to the lost cause punctuated across that avenue. And of course, after years of critical actions and organizing in May and June of this year, following the traumatic murder of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, and the reckoning around systemic racism, local organizers and activists transformed that previously untouchable and kind of pristine site into a place that the New York Times has called the greatest piece of protest art since World War II. This was not an official program, but it has an organization to it. The area includes handcrafted memorials. There were voter registration. There are people who go there, not because this is a monument that tells a finished history, but it's a place where we're recognizing that our reckoning, that our really deep questioning of how we remember in society is happening in real time. And I think I wanted to bring this up because it's important to think about this as a pivotal site that even if you are building, state-sanctioned official sites of memory, how do you incorporate the lessons here? That is incredibly important, not to try to tuck history into its neat piles of past, present, future, but instead to create spaces where we have portals between the past, present, and future, and they can converge. I wanted to bring up two quotes before I go into the work of Monument Lab that have been really instructive to our work. And, here is a quote from the late Nobel laureate Toni Morrison. And in 1989, she was being interviewed about her novel Beloved, which is, an essential read in terms of American history and the haunts of slavery. And in 1989, she is giving an interview, and she says, "There's no place you or I can go to think about or not think about, to summon the presence or recollect the absences of enslaved peoples. There's no suitable memorial or plaque, wreath or wall, or park or skyscraper lobby. There's no 300-foot tower. There's no small bench by the road. There's not even a tree scored, an initial that I can visit or you can visit in Charleston or Savannah or New York or Providence, or better still, on the banks of the Mississippi. And because such a place does not exist, the book had to." So we are now more than a generation after this quote, and yet there's important things to note. First of all, Toni Morrison has given in this an inventory of the different kinds of ways that we memorialize and commemorate in our society, and that goes from the grand to the mundane. Because of course, in any city, in any locality, in concentrated areas, and of course in trails of nature, we find the names of people and the names of events. And that could include something as big as a memorial, or even as kind of mundane as a plaque in a skyscraper lobby. And of course, when we think about Morrison's sentiment here, there are places where we can go to mark the history of slavery. I know that Montgomery Parks has places where the histories of the Underground Railroad, for example. I think about sites dedicated to Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass in the Maryland area. But the point is still incredibly important to note, because we do not have a national memorial to slavery and to enslaved peoples. We have more and more smaller and now larger attempts. But to think about, I wrote a book about Berlin, and in Berlin there are not just one or two Holocaust memorials. There are Holocaust memorials that take up the space in the capital as big as a city block or as small as a cobblestone. And that has gone hand in hand with educational programs and financial reparations for victims of the Nazi years, to especially to Jewish families. And so I think about this as really important. The last thing I want to say about this slide, and some of you may know this, is this phrase, bench by the road. Well, the Toni Morrison Society responded to this and has installed benches by the road and sites of racial trauma and transformation in our society, outside of the site where Emmett Till was kidnapped, outside of a theater at American University that was desegregated after student protests. And here is an image of Toni Morrison sitting on one while she was still alive. So this idea of marking presence and absence, there, as she said, there was no bench by the road, and now they have created those spaces to mark the ongoing narratives around our histories, and including enslavement and freedom. The other quote I want to bring up is from an author, Zadie Smith, who's not American. She's British. But I bring this up because she actually has been really helpful for us to think about how we talk about the difficulties of history. And in an address that she gave actually in Berlin in the fall of 2016, was reprinted in the New York Review of Books, including this remarkable image on the bottom featuring Angela Merkel and former President Obama. And Zadie Smith, who was also a novelist, was talking about walking through the city of Berlin and being in Germany with her father, who was a World War II veteran, who was part of the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camps. And she talked about how surreal it was for her to talk, in one sense, about the most traumatic, horrific histories that she could imagine, in some senses, walking through and hearing from her father, but also the possibility that life again grew, that out of the greatest sites of wound became some of the most important inspirations for transformation. And she says in reflection, "This is the world I knew. Things have changed, but history is not erased by change, and the examples of the past still hold out new possibilities for all of us. Opportunities to remake for a new generation the conditions from which we ourselves have benefited. Progress is never permanent, will always be threatened, must be redoubled, restated, and reimagined if it is to survive." That's the spirit that I want to introduce the idea of Monument Lab. We really started, as I said, as a classroom project, but moved outside into doing our first public exhibition project in 2015 in the courtyard of Philadelphia City Hall, to citywide exhibition in Philadelphia that engaged 250,000 people in person and several million online, to now doing projects and having partnerships across the country, across the continent, and now elsewhere in the world. And of course, we are rooted in Philadelphia, but we are really a part of a collective of people who work inside and adjacent to our operations. And, it's been an amazing experience and a quite humbling one to have these places of co-creation, of really thinking about knowledge exchange and access. And, whether we've been working hand in hand with a state agency, or diving into a project with a group of 7th graders, or thinking about our artist fellows, including Maryland-based and Baltimore-based Ada Pinkston, we've encountered monument as an idea in so many expansive ways. And so we came up with the definition of monument several years ago that we use today, that a monument is a statement of power and presence in public. And we came up with that definition after listening to people and hearing how they use monument in official and unofficial ways. And of course, this encompasses the bronze and marble, or perhaps the officially mandated historic site or house, but also takes into account the way that everyday people make an imprint in society. They don't always have the tools of bronze and marble. They don't always have the time, the money, or the official power to do so. But we have found is that if you don't have those things, you gather next to a monument or a historic site to amplify your voice, or you build your own monument, and that is how you make your presence felt. We have a process that we utilize across our projects, whether it is a capital project or an exhibition, or it might even just be an everyday engagement with students or with a municipal agency. And we kind of break it down like this. So our first thought is to question. Every one of our projects starts with a question. It's a question that shouldn't have one answer. It should have a multitude of answers and possibilities. And we use that to kind of ground the way that we work. We want to know the answer to these questions. They're not ones that we actually know ahead of time fully. We then look to connect. We want to find the people already doing the work, to not assume that we're starting at square one, but instead we actually have to catch up. And so who are the people who are invested in a place? And I mean that financially, but I also mean that kind of spiritually. Sometimes the keepers of a place, the stakeholders, so to speak, might be grandmothers, or the block captain, or the people who have held events outside, family reunions in that space. So who are the people? Who are the denizens? Then we look to unfix, to unfreeze. We don't assume that a given process, like an RFP or an RFQ, these kind of shorthands often used in the public realm, have to happen, right? We want our process to matter as much as the outcome. And if you want different outcomes, but you have the same process, you're going to actually not hit your goal. We then prototype. We build experimental platforms for contemporary art and participatory research, things that previously you may have just found in a museum or an art festival. We want to have that kind of quality and that vanguard approach, but we want to think about prototyping, because ultimately, as I'll close in my talk, there are no actual permanent monuments. Monuments are all prototypes. They require maintenance money and mindsets to keep them up. So instead, we look for interactive and engaging ways to open up that process. And then finally, we report. We share our findings, our reflections, and sometimes that may result in a new monument or a new historic site. But more so, it's about investing in the groups of people inside and outside of official systems to make sure that we keep true to our vision. I'm going to share with you a few of the prototypes that we've worked on with artists over the years, and then kind of walk you through that process. And here is an example in Germantown, Philadelphia, not Maryland, by the artist Karen Olivier. And we talk about if monuments reflect us. Well, she covered a monument from the Revolutionary War in a mirror. And this is a neighborhood that, was a former colonial outpost. Before that, and the long street behind it, which is now known as Germantown Avenue, was a Lenape walking trail. And the first protests against slavery in the Americas happened just down the block from where this is. But this is a monument, when not covered in a mirror, was covered, is to the Revolutionary War, to a battle lost by General Washington. And it's the kind of memorial that wasn't protested, it wasn't quote unquote controversial. It was actually the kind of thing you walk by every day. It was put in several generations ago and you could easily ignore it. And when Karen put this up out of a long community process of explaining her vision and us kind of working together, it was a really special site. Someone cleaned it once a week without us asking, and at first to our chagrin, but we understood the sentiment. There were prayer circles, there were dances. Sometimes it was really visible, and other times because of the foliage, it disappeared into the landscape. And it opened up a process and has had an afterlife in this community that's really important around what is possible, even as a temporary installation. The artist Taniberger, world-renowned, proposed a monument a few years ago that was in some ways very traditional. It was figural, it was elevated. But Tanya wanted to make a monument, as she said, to new immigrants, to understand both a pride and resilience, but also the kind of loss that happens when moving into a different culture. And so Tanya asked for the sculpture to be made with unfired clay, that it would fall apart over time, that it would be proof of the cycles of presence and absence. And she asked us that, after time, when the sculpture, it would take days and sometimes weeks, depending on the weather, to degrade and the steel armature underneath would be revealed, that we had another one waiting wrapped in a wet cloth with, again, these ideas of cycles. And it was remarkable. I would get texts every morning, this was up, from different people saying, oh my gosh, I'm looking at this. And it was like poetry in motion. And in fact, while it dramatizes this, statues without maintenance money would do this over time. They would fall apart, right? So it's showing something that often doesn't happen in a visible time frame. The artist Mel Chin created the monument To Me. It's a monument of two me's. It's to me, to you, too much me. And the idea is that anyone could be a monument. They could rise to a monumental level, 7 feet up above ground. And in fact, there were 90 feet of ADA accessible ramps snaking behind each of these pedestals. But the one caveat is that someone else could also be rising to monumental status. And what would be your relationship? It's not just a place of the me, the selfie. You had to really figure out your relationship to the person on the other side, the people below. And of course, at various points, we were asked by officials say, well, this takes up a lot of room. Would you put a staircase? Maybe we could have a lift. And, you just get a sense of how power and access actually take up a lot of space. They just are largely invisible. And this, if anything, was as important to see the pedestals as the ramps behind it, to understand the process of ascension, of power, of taking up space. And people did go up in wheelchairs and strollers. in walkers. And it became a space where in just 2 months, 50,000 people rose to the level of monument. Some of the projects are about working with materials that are discarded or recycled. In Philadelphia, we had a building boom over the last few years that also resulted in the loss of some historic architectural elements and historic stock. And in the National Park Service run Washington Square, it's right a block away from the Liberty Bell, the artist Caitlin Pomerantz wanted to create a kind of ghostly residential block. She salvaged stoops, the places you sit outside in a city environment with your neighbors as a threshold between public and private space, and gathered them together in Washington Square Park. We removed benches with the National Park Service. And I'm going to tell you, we thought like, well, people sit on these. Well, we watched the local news the night that we had installed these. The cement was still drying, and the reporter reported live from on the stoop. And anytime you went, it was like watching people come together. They were drawn to it. There were weddings. There was a Pokemon Go meetup. I saw a hip hop video filmed on this, a workout video. But most of the time it was people having a space of their own, and it marked this connection between the past and the present in a way that wasn't cost prohibitive, but it was experimental, and it required a really close partnership with the National Park Service and the local stewards. Here, the talk of the town at that time, Hank Willis Thomas's All Power to All People. This was also cited by the New York Times as one of the top 25 most important pieces of protest art since World War II. In a city where we had our first monument dedicated to a person of color, a full figure monument on city land in 2017, in a city that's majority Black. Hank's piece riffed on Klaus Oldenburg's monumental works in Philadelphia, but also Hank, who's an African-American artist, comes from a family of Black police officers, Black Panthers. His grandmother attended Apex Beauty School in North Philly. And this became an incredibly powerful site. And I will tell you, just like if you're familiar with bronze statues that have patina based on where people touched it, this statue had fingerprints on it every day that you would see it, because people would embrace it and take photos here. It was 8 feet tall, but it was both monumental and at a scale that was approachable. It was not a figural monument. Not all the projects that we've worked on have been statues, and I'm showing you a lot of examples from our citywide 2017 exhibition, but we've done other projects in different ways in a few other places. But this one really sticks close to home. This is from the artist Michelle Angela Ortiz, Seguimos Caminando, We Keep Walking. And Michelle has, for the last several years, worked with mothers who have been detained in immigrant prisons, sometimes with their family, increasingly and tragically with family separation in really dire situations. And she wanted to create a moving monument on the City Hall in Philadelphia, a building that has over 200 sculptures on it that include a lot of figures, both and especially Europeans who came to Philadelphia in previous centuries seeking a better life. And she wanted to draw a kind of comparison with mothers who escaped violence and sought asylum in the United States and how they ended up in Philadelphia. And so several nights a week for the fall in 2017, she projected onto City Hall and played out loud the stories of these mothers who were detained at an immigrant family prison to make them part of the city's landscape. A project in South Philly, it's actually very close to currently a boxed up monument to Christopher Columbus, but years before, because South Philly is such an important place in the history of immigration and migration, my own great-grandparents naturalized in the United States just a few blocks away from here after escaping anti-Semitic violence and waves of pogroms in Eastern Europe. The Artist Clip Collective are brilliant light artists and sound artists, and they created a structure that you could walk through that had the last names of families across generations. You can recognize sometimes ethnicity, and sometimes you can't in the last name, but they took the signatures from shipping manifests or the handwritten manifests. They took stories from the library. You could see names that were Italian, Irish, Jewish, more recently, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, Nepalese, stories of African-American migration, to make a monument that was not about a single figure, but about waves of families finding their way in South Philly. And finally, one of our dear projects, a collaboration between Emeka Ogbo and Ursula Rucker, was an epic poem that you could access on the roof of the library or at solar-powered listening stations. So the idea that there was an epic poem always running that you could just plug in. This was before we had the AirPods, so we have to rethink this for 2020 or 2021. But it was just this idea that there's a kind of heartbeat of the city, or maybe a voice of conscience, and you can always plug into it if you are attuned. And this was incredibly special to us in balance. You can see for every sculpture that you create or every historic site, you can create these poetic, smaller frameworks, but nonetheless, they fill space. They are statements of power and presence. Going alongside with that, we have a monument lab strategy. Monument labbing, anyone can do. It's a verb. We're a group of people, and when we do it, we want to theorize public space while in public space. We hire high school students, artist educators, we work with local colleges and universities, and we gather data and conversations and stories about monuments. This is not a kind of design competition where a winner takes all. This is about knitting together civic discourse. And we've done this in a few different ways. We like to have paper forms that we then create data on the back end to make a low bar for entry, but have a high integrity for the work. If you ever try to fill out something online and you have the wrong character count or you don't know if it's counted, we want to have the face-to-face encounter. This is something we're thinking a lot about in the time of COVID, but we'll continue to have these kind of encounters. And then we share this out in different ways. We've released a field trip this year that can be socially distanced, virtual, or masked in public, that has been done by grade schools and senior citizen groups and graduate programs. And the idea is that you work with what you have. You work with the monuments you've inherited, and you go to the new possible monuments. And this kind of exercise takes you through all the way to proposing a monument and really thinking about how we make statements about our visions and our values. And we share this in different kinds of publications. We put out a book with Temple University Press that came out a year ago yesterday. I was just seeing the pictures online. But we also create all kinds of other publications, newspapers, zines. We worked with the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis and created a big foldable map. And the idea is that for those who read, we want to give you material. We want to have you be able to sink in and have these conversations between scholars and practitioners, students, teachers. But we also, in our projects, want to meet people where they are. And I have had dozens of conversations with people who don't have the time to stop and think. And I get it, because time is precious. But we meet, we intersect, and I have a newspaper in my hand, and they keep walking and they grab the newspaper and we keep talking, and then weeks later they come back when they had time. And it's just amazing to figure out people are incredibly hungry for information. I remember also I was carrying a sign, installing it in the city of Newark. And as we carried the sign, people read over us. It was a new interpretive plaque put in by an artist. And so can you create material, even if you're not having a new prototype monument or a new experiment, that is about knitting together civic conversation? I want to close with a few kind of mantras to put out there, and then of course have time for conversation and question. So the one thing is, I think we use this term permanent in our public art and our museums. And I want to just talk about the idea that no monument is permanent. Nothing is permanent. Instead, there's an aura of permanence. There's a hope for permanence. We want to build monuments and have historical sites to stop the flow of time, to reach across generations. As I said, no monument is permanent. They require mindsets and maintenance money to keep them intact. So what would we say to ourselves if we remove the word permanent? Would we say enduring? Would we say across generations? But also, what ramifications would that have for our planning? We might budget in moments for evolution. We might put into it not just technology, but the ability to have maintenance and upkeep. And so I think, when we advise a municipal agency or entity, we try to think about that. What is the way that this will evolve? And we hear from the members of the public in our research all the time. They are envisioning time in such complex ways, and we want to have historic sites that also are long-standing, speak across generation, but take into account the questions of permanence. I was thinking the probably most mark that I will leave, no matter how many monuments I'm a part of, is the plastic. that will live beyond, right? And so how do we think about time in a different and more inviting way where we're understanding the contributions we make? The next thing I say is that there are no neutral public spaces. Sometimes you hear in the debate around monuments, if we could only find a museum or a park to put a monument in, it would be good. And I just want to say, you know, in the spirit of a remarkable movement started by Latanya S. Autry and Mike Murawski, museums are not neutral, which is a hashtag that's been uttered 1 million times online across the world. What if we, instead of thinking about and looking for that elusive neutral public space or the objective story, what if we actually did a little bit of work to understand the exclusions built into our public spaces, the challenges, the limits, but also the ways that people have found ways to overcome that? I think we could look at, for example, when we are inviting not just all people in a generic way, but understanding the legacies, for example, of hyper-policing or surveillance on Black and Brown communities, how to understand how public spaces are often sites of necessity of resource, of maintenance. And maybe then we can reinvent something that's not aiming to be neutral or not aiming to not be controversial, which is a statement that everything could be controversial based on who is in charge. But instead thinking about the intentions we want for public spaces that can be not just inclusive, but take into account the legacies of exclusion. I just have a few more slides, and this is out there for all the people in positions of decision making. What are your tools? Well, I would say be creative. Use your budgets, use your maintenance funds, use your inventories, your conservation. Note that I didn't put up new signs, because yes, we could always put up new interpretive signs, but I think this is a moment where I'm hearing from so many municipal figures that are really rethinking their relationships. They're like, wait a second, we could take our maintenance funds and redistribute them to rethink what has to be kept pristine and clean. We have people who are really figuring out okay, look, we're all in a moment of shared sacrifice and challenge in our field. How do we work together in new ways? How could people work across departments or sectors? And just thinking about the necessity for creativity and the response to the call of our time to be more fuller in our democracy and our systems of equity and equality. We have to go to the nitty-gritty. We have to, in small and big ways, find purpose so we don't get the same outcomes with the same processes. And then finally, balance, presence, and absence, loss, and resilience. Something that we hear all the time from our artists, from our fellows, is figuring out how to take what we've inherited of our monuments, of our historic sites, and understand both how to have pride and hope and resilience from those stories, but also understand the stories that we're missing. Who has been left off the pedestal? Whose stories not just have been cut out or diminished, but what are the processes of erasure? You know, here is an image from someone I mentioned, Ada Pinkston, who's based in Baltimore and a Monument Lab fellow whose project Landmarked occurred here on the former pedestal to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in Baltimore. And this is not a historically distant structure. That monument was installed in 1947 in Baltimore and removed, you know, in 2017. And so I think what's really important in this moment, and I want to kind of close here, is that, you know, I'm a public space advocate and denizen, and I think a lot of you appreciate the kind of weaving together of public space and also sites of commemoration. You know, but we're in a moment of profound challenge in our society. Close to 300,000 people have died from the coronavirus. We have ongoing crises alongside spirit of resilience, and we're not looking for a quick fix. We're not looking for a single fix. We are looking for ways that we can braid together the past, present, and future to account for the catastrophic loss, for the systems and structures and symbols that have kept us back from being our full democracy, and really trying to work together to critically engage the monuments that we have inherited and the historic legacies that we walk into, and to unearth the next generation of monuments through stories of hope, resistance, resilience, and vision for moving ahead. And on that note, I say thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was an incredible presentation. I did visit Philadelphia 2 years ago with a contingent of my staff to tour park and recreation agencies. My friend, the director up there of Philadelphia Park and Recreation, Catherine Ott Lavelle, hosted us. I absolutely regret that I was not aware of Monument Lab at that time, but I promise when we make a return trip, we will go to your website where I'm sure we can readily find directions to all of the locations of the incredible monuments you showed us today. So thank you so much. We do have some really good questions coming in from the audience, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I don't know whether we'll be able to get to all of them, but let me start. I won't name full names. I'll just name a first name of the person asking the question. So we have a question from Anne. How have young creatives been involved in these types of projects?
Mm-hmm. So, I think for us, intergenerational conversation is incredibly important, and collaboration. And so what that has meant for us, from our very first project, was to engage young people and engage teachers as part of the stewards and decision makers in public space. The first project that we did in the courtyard of City Hall, I didn't show a picture of it, but it's from the artist Terry Adkins. And we asked him what was an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia in 2015. And he said an empty classroom. And he said that, in Philadelphia, we're known for our educational innovation and institutions, but we were also known at that time for school closures and budget cuts. And he wanted to create a sculpture in the middle of City Hall. And in part, he was inspired by seeing in the public debates about those budget cuts, students, teachers, parents coming together and protesting at City Hall. He thought it was a realization of the city's founder, so-called founder William Penn's vision for a meeting place in the middle of the city. In that project, it was important for us to invest in young people. We, hired college students, but even more than that, we hired high school students to be our analysts. Our grant, which from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage at that time, didn't mandate that we have any kind of feedback, but a lot of times with a grantor, they want to know how effectively you spent your money. And so we said, let's put investment into working with young people and actually creating a framework where not only they would gain skills, but we actually wanted to know what they had to say. How did they read all the public proposals that came in and see the project? And it culminated with a meeting with the public art office in the city at that time. And it kind of set up a framework for us, like, okay, we want to create spaces where young people have the spirit of inquiry, and they can, and perhaps they can be kind of agents in cutting through skepticism and instead bringing that spirit of inquiry and having moments of exchange where public officials also have the ability to hear new, exciting, innovative ideas that they don't get to do in their everyday work. Over time, what that has meant for us is continuing to hire young people. We hired high school research fellows in our 2017 exhibition. And since then, when we offered our National Fellows Program, our first cohort had young people who are now in their college years, but were in high school. People like Zy Bryant from Charlottesville, who as a high school student started the petition in Charlottesville to remove the Robert E. Lee statue, which set off of course, as we know, a national dialogue. Kenyansola Anafowishe, based in Chicago, who had a project called In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. A Long Walk Home, and also in Chicago, a group of young women, mostly of color, who are seeking to end sexual violence and do so through art making in public spaces. So that spirit of intergenerational dialogue is incredibly important, and make sure that we can build across generations and invest in the next generation of monument leaders and visionaries.
Thank you, Paul. Our next question comes from Chris. Chris asks, is there a monument to the MOVE bombing that happened in Philadelphia?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And for those who may or may not know, the MOVE bombing is a kind of shorthand for a long series of clashes between a Black radical group whose ideas in the 70s and 80s may have seemed radical, but they have been incorporated into mainstream understandings, the importance of a kind of approach to ecology, especially. Over the years, they clashed with Philadelphia police, and it culminated, and I'm collapsing a lot of history here, into a confrontation in 1985 on Mother's Day, in which the city and state police dropped an explosive device on a house where MOVE members were inside, and it resulted in the killing of 13 MOVE members. And the destruction, the burning of approximately 60 homes in West Philadelphia. It's a wound. It's a moment in our city that is the moment we bombed ourselves, but also for, especially as you hear the testimonies of Black Philadelphians, a point of real precarity, right? And Black neighbors in that largely neighborhood felt that the city had failed them. It was a really complex moment. And I will say, this was 1985. The City of Philadelphia City Council issued an apology in November of 2020 for this event. There has been a process for building a memorial at the site, but in large part, as it's been unfolding over the last few years, sponsored by the city, it's not meant as a memorial for the MOVE bombing or a reckoning with that important recent local history. It's instead kind of percent for art program that goes along with redevelopment, that is meant to kind of, rather than look to the past, it's meant to speak to the present. And of course, it's difficult to do that. I think, as I noted, there's no neutral ground. There's one marker, and this might link back to the other question I want to bring up. A local school, the Jubilee School, a group of young people in grade school, proposed a historic marker through the official Pennsylvania state system that was installed on Cobbs Creek Parkway, adjacent to the site of the MOVE bombing that went in the last 5 years. And so, when you think about, in the absence of an official memorial, there have been these other gestures. There have been films like Let the Fire Burn. There have been important poems. There have been important literature. But really, that marker, which was the will of young people, and others who supported them, is the main site that we have in Philadelphia. And time will tell whether we'll be able to not only have a site of memory, but have even more of a dialogue about the legacies of that traumatic event. It's not a distant past, it's still with us today.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Deborah. Deborah writes, I am a member of the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project. Our goal is to educate people about the history of racial terrorism in this country. A sub-goal of our work is to obtain the EJI Peace and Legacy Memorial marker that names the 3 known victims of lynching in this county, Mr. George Peck, Mr. Sidney Randolph, and Mr. John Diggs Dorsey. If we are successful, how do we begin to create an installation space that makes people think about what this means?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. But Deborah, thank you for your work, and to all of the members of your team that are part of a local but also national movement to really reckon with the history of racist terrorism against Black people in this country that coincided with Black freedom movements and struggles. I'd be really curious to learn from you about what you've been doing. I can offer some insights based on conversations I've had with folks in other municipalities. And again, for those who might not know, this is like of the monument work that's been happening around the country over the last decade. If you don't know about EJI's National Memorial to Peace and Justice, please look it up. Brian Stevenson and the group at EJI, who've long time been advocates for the fair and just treatment of people on death row in situations that unconstitutional rulings have rendered people behind bars. They've set out over the last several years to make these connections between our past and our present justice system, researching more than 4,000 lynchings that occurred after the end of the Civil War, after emancipation. And this is not just bound to the Deep South, across the country. right? And that number is a frightening number. It's probably, though it's large, it's probably actually an underestimation. This is just what they were able to find in their research. And they've had a process that they've gone through in collaboration with Mass Design, a social interest architecture group that also builds memorials, where they have worked on the research. They have, oftentimes with family members and descendants, gathered soil around the site where that lynching may have occurred, and have gathered that in a site in Montgomery, Alabama, that you can view the nation and the history of lynching and of racist terrorism from that site. Of course, members of your group that you're mentioning, I think of others that I've met along the way, people in Birmingham, Alabama, people in Clayton, Missouri, for example, who have been, Charlottesville is another one, where people have on a local level worked to put in a historical marker. You know, you think about historic markers often going at sites where we have, sometimes there are places we have pride, sometimes they're battlefields. This is not the battlefield in the traditional sense, but of course it was a war waged against formerly enslaved, emancipated African Americans and then their descendants. So the historic marker in site is really important. And another part that the memorial has been working on is at the site in Montgomery, there is a kind of pillar for every county in the United States that had registered a lynching against a Black man, woman, or child. And right outside of that location, there's one identical for every county in the United States to reclaim their own. I mean, it's a remarkable visionary project. I don't know to the extent how many of those have been kind of brought back to the county, but I will say just, you know, again, that was context that you probably already know about. I wanted to share that for other people. One of the questions that's come up in a few places, like where we've been called to be on a panel for advice of like how to do it. And we said, you know, again, this notion of process matters as much as outcome. You can ask for a delivery and it can show up and you work on that. But there is something really important to go on here, which is, again, marking this history and also marking the way it's been suppressed and erased and underemphasized as part of American history, the horrors of lynching and the realities of what emancipation brought and what freedom has meant and the challenges that we face. So, you know, one of the things I would say is, like, of course, you engage professionals like landscape architects and engineers, but I think there's a question I have, which is, what do you want to know? How would you bring this in? Is there special programs? Are there dialogues? Is there a processional? What would be the life of this marker to create a space of healing? Would it mean an annual program? Would it mean education program? And I think, like, whether those are small efforts or big efforts, one of the things, as you say, if you're successful, and I hope and trust you will be, is to make those connections between the past, present, and future. So maybe asking the public not where they would like to see it, that's an idea, but also how they want to engage with it. What are ways that you build a community and a constituency around this marker before it ever gets there, before you get the final permission, before it gets the okay? You've created a circle of people. You may have already done this already, but I think about that as incredibly important. Both investing in the material costs and the process it takes to get something built, but also invest in the groups of people, the social groups, the organizations that are going to be part of that as well.
So I think we're coming up at the end of our time, Paul. I do want to ask one final question I see here, and I apologize to those who did ask other. There's some really great questions here. I wish we had more time, but I think this is very flattering to you. And this question already has a bunch of likes. It's, will Monuments Lab have a field office in the DC area?
Well, thank you for that. And I mean, thank you for this. I wish we could get to all the questions, but the ones you've asked have been so thoughtful, and just a special acknowledgement to the people who have been doing the work on the job, off the job. So I just want to give a lot of credit. It's always inspiring to hear about the work that people do, often against great odds, to bring about a fuller story of history in our public spaces. And for those who didn't get a chance to ask get their question answered, let's keep the dialogue going. You can follow us on social media at monument_lab or join our mailing list. So, but the idea of a field office, I love that idea in the DC area. And one thing I would put with that, so, we haven't announced exactly what the call will be or where the locations will be, but this is part of our collaboration with the Mellon Foundation on the Monuments Project. We're doing our national audit right now, and as we release it in the spring, we want you all to be engaged. We want to get you a copy, whether it's digital or like a newspaper print, and maybe do events around the country with it. But I think after that, we'll release our open call, where we're going to be looking for teams of people, coalitions, artists, designers, teachers, organizers, who will come together and really work to not only dive deeper into the findings of the audit, but also look about the monuments that are not yet built, that might take different forms. They might end up being future installations and markers, but they might also be poetry festivals and living walls and new parks. And so I think I want to just put that spirit out there. We would love to connect with and meet if the opportunity connects to have a field office in the DC area. But I know, both because of our proximity and all of the things that are happening in the DC area and in Montgomery Parks, all of the places adjacent, that like it's exciting to learn from and gain new perspectives from you. So I hope we stay in contact. If the opportunity aligns, that's great. But even more than that, we're a big circle here, and we look out for each other, whether you're inside or outside a system, whether you are a big decision maker, or you're someone who pushes the imperatives of ethics, integrity, of inclusion. We want you to know that you have a team of people who are here also cheering you on as well.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. That was a very impressive presentation. The work you're doing is so meaningful. It's very, very difficult work, but it's such important work to move our society forward. So I do want to thank you and your team for doing such great work, and thank you for giving us your time today. So thank you all for joining us. One more apology to those who asked questions we couldn't get to. I really appreciate the spirit of participation in this. So obviously everyone was very engaged in listening, because I don't think I've ever seen so many questions pop up in one of our sessions so far. Those of you who enjoyed today's session, there will be future sessions, so please stay tuned on our website, montgomeryparks.org/speaker series, for announcements of upcoming sessions. Of course, we'll advertise them on social media and by other means. And I thank you for joining us today. And please, Paul won't hear a virtual round of applause, but please give him a virtual round of applause. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Montgomery Parks.